The cameras were rolling when Barack Obama said the words that would tear Carlos Martinez's world apart all over again. But Carlos didn't know that yet. He was refilling water glasses behind the cameras, invisible to everyone except the man whose policies had destroyed his family 7 years ago. The man who was about to lie about it on national television. In exactly 3 minutes, Carlos would do something that had never happened in the history of late-night TV. He would call a former president a liar to his face, and America would watch it happen. The Late Show studio hummed with its usual reverent energy whenever a former president appeared. 300 audience members sat straighter in their seats, phones tucked away despite the temptation, all sensing they were witnessing history. But they had no idea how much history they were about to see. The iconic New York skyline stretched behind David's desk, Manhattan's towers glowing against deep blue curtains in the warm studio lights. It was the perfect backdrop for what looked like a perfect interview with America's most beloved former president. Perfect until the invisible young man in the catering vest decided to make himself seen. Obama sat with that familiar presidential bearing, relaxed yet authoritative, his salt and pepper hair catching the lights as he gestured with practiced ease. He wore a crisp navy suit that probably cost more than Carlos made in 3 months, his American flag pin gleaming like a small beacon of hope and hypocrisy. His smile was warm, his demeanor approachable, his answers polished to perfection. He was everything Carlos had once believed in, everything his mother had died believing in, everything that had turned out to be a beautiful lie. Immigration was one of the hardest challenges of my presidency, Obama was saying, his voice carrying that recognizable cadence that had once inspired millions. But I'm proud that we kept families together whenever possible. The DACA program protected young people who came here as children through no fault of their own. David Letterman nodded from behind his mahogany desk, his expression showing the kind of respectful attention reserved for former commanders-in-chief. At 68, David had interviewed presidents and celebrities, but Obama carried a gravitas that made even seasoned hosts sit up straighter. In the catering area behind the cameras, Carlos Martinez felt his hands shake as he set down the water pitcher. 24 years old, with tired eyes that had seen too much loss, he wore the standard black vest and white shirt of service staff, the uniform of invisibility. But tonight, invisibility felt like complicity. Carlos had been working catering jobs for 3 years, moving through elite events like a ghost. It was fitting in a way. His entire existence in America had become about being useful but invisible, present but silent. He was listening to every word Obama said, and each one felt like salt in wounds that had never properly healed. We understood that every policy decision affected real families. Obama continued, his tone growing more passionate. We tried to be humane, to remember that behind every case number was a human being with dreams, with families, with hopes for a better life. The words hit Carlos like physical blows. Real families, human beings, dreams. Tell that to his mother, who died alone in Guadalajara last month while Carlos couldn't even attend her funeral because leaving America meant never coming back. Carlos had been 17 when the deportation officers came to their small apartment in Phoenix. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2015, a day that had started like any other and ended with his family shattered. His parents, Maria and Jose Martinez, had been in America for 22 years. They'd arrived as teenagers, crossed the desert with nothing but hope, built a life from scratch in a country that needed their labor but questioned their right to exist. They'd paid taxes under fake Social Security numbers, contributed to a system that would eventually use their contributions to fund their own deportation. Jose worked construction. Maria cleaned houses for wealthy families who never asked about her status but always complimented her work. They were the kind of immigrants politicians talked about when they needed to sound compassionate, hardworking, family-oriented, community-minded. But in 2015, under Obama's enforcement policies, being hardworking wasn't enough. Carlos had watched through his bedroom window as immigration officers led his parents away in handcuffs. His mother had looked back once, her eyes finding his, and mouthed "Te amo" before disappearing into a van that would take her to a detention center, then to a country she'd left as a teenager. DACA had saved Carlos, barely. His application had been approved just months before the raid. He could stay, finish high school, go to community college, work legally. He was one of the lucky ones, they told him. Protected. But protection felt hollow when you were eating dinner alone every night, when Christmas came without your mother's tamales, when you graduated college with no one to cheer in the audience. Protected meant staying safe in a country that had expelled the people who made it home. The system was broken when I inherited it, Obama was saying now, his voice taking on that familiar defensive tone politicians used when discussing uncomfortable truths. We did our best to fix what we could while enforcing the laws as they existed. Carlos's jaw clenched. Enforcing the laws. Such clean, clinical language for destroying families. David was asking about the human cost of immigration enforcement, about the criticism Obama had faced from Latino communities. Some called you the deporter-in-chief, David said carefully. How do you reconcile that with your stated commitment to keeping families together? Obama's expression tightened slightly, the only sign that the question hit a nerve. That's a painful label, but I understand the frustration. We deported people who had committed crimes, who posed threats to national security. But we also tried to prioritize keeping families intact whenever legally possible. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Carlos had heard this before, the careful parsing of language, the emphasis on criminals and threats, but his parents weren't criminals. His mother's biggest crime was cleaning the houses of people who paid her less than minimum wage. His father's offense was building the homes that housed American families, whenever legally possible. As if the law was some immutable force of nature rather than choices made by people like the man sitting 20 feet away from Carlos. That's when it happened. Carlos didn't plan it, didn't think about the consequences. But when Obama said the words that would shatter him, when the former president looked directly into the camera and said, "I sleep well at night knowing we tried to do right by immigrant families," something inside Carlos broke. He stood up from where he'd been crouched behind the catering station. The movement was sudden enough that a nearby camera operator turned to look. Then another crew member. Then David himself, whose trained television instincts could spot disruption from across a studio. "Ma'am," David said, then corrected himself as he focused on Carlos. "Sir, are you okay back there?" The studio fell silent. Not the manufactured quiet of a commercial break, but the deep silence that comes when something unscripted and potentially explosive is about to unfold on live television. Producers in the control room began gesturing frantically at their assistants, uncertain whether to cut to commercial or let this moment play out. Obama turned in his chair, his presidential training kicking in as he assessed this unexpected situation. Security personnel shifted subtly, hands moving toward concealed positions, though Carlos posed no physical threat beyond the danger of truth-telling. Carlos walked toward the stage area, his catering vest suddenly feeling like a scarlet letter marking his service class status. 300 audience members watched this unknown young man approach the most powerful platform in late-night television. Some reached for their phones before remembering the strict no-recording policy. Others simply stared, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. "I'm sorry," Carlos said. His voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for the studio microphones to catch. "I'm sorry, but I can't listen to this anymore." David stood up from behind his desk, his journalist instincts recognizing that something significant was happening. This wasn't a planned segment or a publicity stunt. This was raw, unfiltered reality interrupting the carefully choreographed world of late-night television. "What's your name, son?" David asked, his voice gentle, but carrying across the hushed studio. "Carlos Martinez," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "and I need to tell President Obama something that he needs to hear." Obama remained seated, but turned to face Carlos fully, his expression carefully neutral. This was uncharted territory. Former presidents didn't usually face unscripted confrontations on friendly talk shows, But Obama's political instincts were legendary, and he understood that how he handled this moment would define not just the rest of the interview, but potentially his legacy. "Mr. President," Carlos said, and the title felt like broken glass in his mouth. Every syllable carried 7 years of suppressed anger, grief, and disappointment. "You say you kept families together whenever possible? You say you did right by immigrant families, but I haven't seen my parents in 7 years because of your deportation policies. 7 years, Mr. President. Do you know what 7 years feels like when you're an orphan?" The studio atmosphere shifted instantly. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a young man calling a former president to account for the human cost of his policies. Obama's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition that this moment was about to become something he couldn't control. "I'm sorry to hear about your situation," he said carefully, falling back on diplomatic language. But Carlos wasn't interested in diplomacy. "My mother died last month in Mexico," Carlos continued, his voice clear and strong. "Maria Elena Martinez. She was 62 years old. She died alone because your administration deported her when I was 17. The specificity hit like a slap. This wasn't abstract policy discussion. This was a name, an age, a woman who had existed and suffered and died. "She died alone," Carlos repeated, "because I couldn't go to her funeral. If I leave this country, the only country I've ever known, I can't come back. Your DACA program protected me, but orphaned me." David stepped closer. "Carlos, tell us exactly what happened to your family." Carlos took a shaky breath. "March 15th, 2015, ICE came to our apartment in Phoenix at 6:47 a.m. My parents had been here for 22 years. They paid taxes, never committed crimes, never did anything except work and raise their children." The detail was devastating. 6:47 a.m., a teenager watching his world end. "They took my parents in handcuffs," Carlos said, his voice breaking, "like criminals. My mother looked back at me and said, 'Te amo, mijo, portad bien.' I love you, son. Be good." Those were her last words to me in person. The Spanish hung in the air, foreign and familiar. "And you know what the worst part is, Mr. President? She never stopped believing in you. She watched your speeches about immigration reform, about keeping families together." Obama's mask was slipping now. "The last thing she said to me was, 'Maybe Presidente understands us now,'" Carlos said, his voice breaking completely. "She died believing that you cared about families like ours. She died with hope." The silence in the studio was deafening. Obama's carefully constructed narrative about humane enforcement was crumbling in real time, victim to the testimony of someone who had lived the reality behind the rhetoric. Obama stood up slowly, his composure finally beginning to crack. For just a moment, he wasn't a former president or a political figure. He was a man confronting the human wreckage of his own decisions. "Carlos," Obama said, his voice rougher than usual, stripped of presidential polish, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. The system was broken before I came into office, and despite our best efforts, I couldn't fix it fast enough to help families like yours." "But you could have chosen not to deport them," Carlos replied, his voice steady despite the tears. "You could have chosen to prioritize actual criminals instead of my parents. You could have chosen to see them as human beings instead of case numbers." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. David watched this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing history in the making. This wasn't scripted political theater. This was accountability happening in real time, broadcast to millions of Americans who rarely saw their leaders confronted so directly. "You're right," Obama said, and the admission seemed to surprise even him. "You're absolutely right. I made choices that separated families, and I have to live with that. Your mother's death, your pain, that's on me too." Carlos wiped his eyes, 7 years of suppressed grief and anger pouring out in front of the cameras. "I wanted to hate you," he said. "For years I wanted to hate you, but she wouldn't let me. She said hate would poison me, that you were just a man trying to do an impossible job." She was wiser than I was, Obama said softly, and for the first time since entering politics, he sounded genuinely humbled. Maybe, Carlos said. But that doesn't bring her back. That doesn't give me the chance to say goodbye. That doesn't fix the fact that your policies turned me into an orphan in the only country I've ever called home. The cameras captured every moment of this extraordinary confrontation. A young immigrant calling a former president to account, a leader forced to confront the human cost of his policies, a moment when political rhetoric met lived reality and lost. David looked at both men, then at the audience, then directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break, but what we just witnessed, this is why democracy matters. This is why the people affected by policy need to be heard by the people who make policy. As the cameras cut to commercial, Obama walked over to Carlos and did something unexpected. He reached out and embraced the young man who had just held him accountable, on national television. "I'm sorry," Obama whispered, and for the first time it sounded like more than political rhetoric. It sounded like a man recognizing the weight of power and the price paid by those who had no voice in the rooms where decisions were made. Carlos stood there for a moment, accepting the embrace from the man whose policies had orphaned him, feeling the complicated mixture of anger and grief and something that might eventually become forgiveness. The studio remained silent, 300 people processing what they had just witnessed. Not just a political confrontation, but a moment of human reckoning. The letter his mother had written him before she died was still in his apartment, still unread because reading it would make her death final. But maybe tonight he would finally have the courage to open it, to hear her voice one last time, to begin the long process of turning grief into something that honored her memory rather than perpetuated his pain. Because sometimes speaking truth to power doesn't change the past, but it might just change what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.